Hey there, it's Pastor Rob. Welcome to episode 2 of Cutting Room Floor. This is where I take something that didn't quite make it into the weekly message here at Sunny Slope Church, and I give you a little more detail on it. Not everything can make it into a good sermon. You have to know when to cut some things out and when to leave some things on the cutting room floor. And so, but what I like to do is come back to one of those things and in a little extra video, just kind of draw your attention to them, mostly because I find them somewhat interesting and worth looking at. And often they have some relevance and some applicability. And today I want to do that. I want to look at a detail in this story. Yesterday at church, we looked at a story from Joshua 2. In Joshua 2, Joshua sends a couple of spies into the city of Jericho. And in the city of Jericho, they are hidden by Rahab. And then if you remember at the end of the story, they make an agreement. They actually make a covenant, and the spies promise that they will spare the life of Rahab, just as she spared their life. And then there's this curious detail. They Rahab puts a scarlet cord out of her window, and then that's a way of marking off this home as one that is to be preserved from destruction. And so it's by virtue of this. It's the scarlet cord then that marks them safe from death. Some people looked at that and said, well, that kind of helps us see a connection to Jesus, right? You get the scarlet cord, you get the red blood of Jesus, just as Rahab was saved by the scarlet cord or the red cord, so the red blood of Jesus saves God's people. Well, that's an interesting connection. I'm not sure that it's supported by the text. I don't think there's anything in the text of Joshua that is meant to link us to the New Testament in quite that way. But I do want to suggest to you that this red cord has some significance. And I want to point you to something. I'm going to share my screen here a quick second so that you can see this. I'm bringing you here to Genesis chapter 38. Genesis 38 tells us this story of one of Jacob's sons, a man named Judah. And Judah ends up being, he goes and he has sex with someone called Tamar, and she gets pregnant by him. Now, Tamar is, you can see here, Tamar is accused of becoming pregnant by immorality. Essentially, she is labeled as, it's suggested that she is a prostitute. And actually, yeah, there's other places in this text where Judah, here you can see earlier, Judah saw her. He thought she was a prostitute. So this Tamar Judah looks at her and sees that she's a sexually promiscuous woman. He assumes that she is, and he assumes that she's a prostitute, has sex with her, and she gets pregnant. And Judah gets very self-righteous. He says, well, she's pregnant by immorality, and because of that, he is ready to put her to death. Now, without going into all the details of Genesis chapter 38, one of the things that stands out is essentially Tamar finds a way to let Judah know, hey, before you kill me, you might want to know that actually you are the father of the children I'm pregnant with. And Judah all of a sudden realizes that he's accusing her of being a prostitute and being sexually immoral, and he is just as bad as she was. The interesting thing in this story, the interesting thing is when it comes time for Tamar to give birth, she has twins. And the midwife, you see, the midwife ties, here's where it's interesting, a scarlet thread around the wrist of one of the children. And that's a way to mark which child is the oldest, which child comes out first. Well, it doesn't quite work out that way. It turns out that child draws his hand back in, and then the other child is born first. But it is worth noting that that there's one of the children associated with this prostitute who is sentenced to death, and it's this scarlet thread that's kind of tied into that story. And then when you get into the New Testament, in Matthew's gospel, once again, it's interesting because we get the name of Judah, the father of Perez and Zerah. Zerah was the child with the red cord around him. And once again, Tamar is named. So once again, you get this sexually promiscuous woman who's accused of being a prostitute, who is saved and associated with this red cord. So it's almost like the red cord becomes this way by which God marks out his people, his elect, his chosen people, the people that he's going to preserve through means of a scarlet cord. Now, is that 100% meant to be the connection? It's hard to say. Sometimes there are these links in the Bible that aren't 100% for certain, but I think it's worth looking at. The other little detail in the story that I wanted to just point you to for just a second, just for some extra consideration. Again, this is one of these things. It's hard to know for certain. Are we intended to get this meeting, or is this just a coincidence? And I think this is one of these things. It's hard to know for sure. But back in Joshua chapter 2, Rahab hides the spies under the stalks of flax that she had hidden on the roof. Now, one of the details is there's some speculation that flax, which is like this fabric, essentially, it's a stalk of like a grass that can be woven into a fabric. It's interesting that some have suggested, well, that was used for grave clothes in those days. When you would bury someone, you'd bury them you'd make grave clothes out of flax. And so they're hidden under this flax. And some have drawn a parallel, especially because they're there for the length of 3 days. And so there's this idea that these men essentially are being buried and then raised to life again, brought into life again. And the imagery is that of being hidden under the flax seed and then brought back up again. Now, I personally think that's probably a stretch, but it's one of these details that at least makes you think a little bit and wonder if maybe that was intentional, or maybe it's one of these shadows that's meant to be there. So anyways, hey, thanks for watching again today. A little bit of extra from Sunday's sermon. Thanks for joining me, and we'll see you again next week.